So I'm beginning to like my panelists because every one of them seems to allow me to link to another panelist. So you mentioned LTE, so I'll turn to Rajan. So Rajan, before we talk about LTE, some years ago, WiMAX was looked at as the be-all, end-all. It's going to solve all the world's problems with last mile. Being a fee-paying IEEE member for a very long time and being part of the Standards Association which developed that standard, it was a disaster any way you look at it. Okay, in terms of its commercial uptake, and mostly it went down to price, in my opinion. The cost of the base stations were too expensive, and recouping the ROI, the return on investment, was just too hard. But let's forget WiMAX. To me, it's a dead technology, frankly speaking. Right? I think we've got other great things that are coming up, LTE being one. In my mind, LTE is a last mile solution. Right? Okay. Can we get it cheap enough to serve these little villages in more or less the middle of India, which doesn't have the purchasing power that we would have in semi-urban or urban centers? Thoughts from you?
Yeah, first of all, I think whether you're 2G, 3G, LTE, any other alphabet soup is going to be totally immaterial as we go forward. Because when you look at the radio access network and the core network, the core network is already, IP enabled, and then the RAN, radio access network, is almost there. And equipment manufacturers are really making it agnostic as to what part of the spectrum you use. It depends upon the application. So just to a few data points before we go to answer the question. First of all, if you look at the new UL license, all right, they are disaggregated. So you've got state level license, district level license, and then sub-district level, subject to a minimum aggregation of things, right? So it's just not national and all that. So that's the new UL. The only spectrum that you can use is unlicensed spectrum if you want to use spectrum. Otherwise, you would have to go and bid for spectrum yourself, right? So that's going to be the new mandate. So the question comes back to saying, okay, come back to the last mile. What is the technology that's going to be used? And our point of view is saying is that, listen, operators, certainly from our end, will use multiple technologies to get to the last mile. All right. So where is the critical choke point today? Critical choke point today is the access medium. We all agree that it's going to be a mobile access device. And so what is the application? In places that haven't been accessed, right, voice is still the dominant application, right? And the use, 70%, right? It's only now that data is catching on. And we expect that if data is going to be the predominant use going forward, video is going to be the significant component of that, which means that you're going to have a smartphone, and the price point of that smartphone is going to be absolutely critical in terms of take up in the rural area. All right, today we're talking about a price point of about 7,000 plus minus for a halfway decent smartphone. It needs to get to sub 5,000 rupees before it becomes a true affordable issue in terms of the rural marketplace. Second issue in terms of saying is how much are you willing to pay for consumption of this bandwidth, right? So that's a second critical criteria. I don't know what that price point is. Is it 100 rupees? Is it 50 rupees? The average recharge amount, by the way, is 10 rupees in India. All right, 30% of all recharges are 10 rupees. All right, so what is it saying? It's saying it's the old sachet. It's saying nobody's going to put on $100. It's going to be this recurring. So the critical point that constrains usage is infrastructure. Now, one of the things that the government has been talking about is saying is that, look, we'll bring the fiber to the Gram Panchayat, right? And you guys take it last mile, however you want to use it, and that's intended to be mobility. Well, we're saying, okay, fine. There's a problem with this whole thing, which is the BBNL issue. It isn't an end-to-end connectivity point. All right, so the whole cost of providing the backhaul isn't in place right now. So that's why we haven't been very keen to be able to get to the point where we're saying is that we're ready for last mile. So the other constraint on last mile is simply the cost in the economics. So you're going to have to talk about a subsidy model. Where is the subsidy going to come from? It was supposed to come from the USO fund. The USO fund today is used for everything but subsidizing rural. So we're going to have to fix that problem in terms of saying last mile. I think operators will fix the last mile if you fix the BBNL problem And if you say, listen, when there is a funding gap, use the USO fund to incentivize us to provide that. Don't continue to charge us 5% and say, that, listen, for every non-viable area you service, we're ready to reduce your USO fund by a percentage point. I'll tell you, we'll be there in a heartbeat.
Okay, so okay, I'm just trying to get my thoughts around this. So, Ravina, I'm going to bring you in to the conversation since you were looking so interested. NFO and FON. So Rajan has, I think, clearly stated what the issue is. So what do we do to move beyond? Because that only comes to panchayat level, correct? There's still a long way to go beyond the panchayat level. And then I think Rajan also quite clearly laid the cost of the device, the cost of the actual access itself, and so on and so forth, and the content consumption costs. I think we also sometimes forget that content also costs money, right? I mean, yes, there's a lot of free content around there, but there's also content that you need to pay for. The Ford Foundation, of course, has been doing some interesting work in this area in India with DEF and others. So maybe some observations from you on what you see, not as necessarily the issues, but how can we overcome the challenges?
Yeah, thank you for that question, because some of the outcomes from last time's convening that you had, the issues are still not resolved, right? So we keep coming back to them in that case. We can't really escape them. There isn't, one angle of work that has already been dealt with, so we can start on a new one. So I think we're going to keep coming back to that issue of last mile connectivity, because that really hasn't been resolved. Whatever the big national networks are, fiber or the operators, in the spectrum space, we really don't see them having moved the last mile at all. So I do think that there is a need for diversifying the ISP scenario, facilitating licenses. I don't see how we can rely on the business models that are currently in place without looking at small and medium businesses and bringing them into that fray, because a license is given with the assumption of universal access, and that is not being realized at that level. So I want to believe in the trickle down of a technology that will solve all this and be so cheap and so affordable and still profitable for the operator. It's just hard to believe that when we haven't seen that happen, and are we still going to keep waiting for that Godot, or are we going to take other existing forms of connectivity and really try to incentivize local people who care, who are already present in the rural areas? And as far as cable, I think it's a great idea, but cable is not necessarily the mode of broadcast, transmission in a lot of rural areas. And when there aren't those cable operators, so you can't, there's not one model. I think there has to be new kinds of players in this space. It's not that there's an automatic technology transfer, right, from the cable operator to the, so it's a new ball game. So I think that there's a challenge in, of course, absorbing the techies that are already there, that should be absorbed, but at the same time, making space for the new players in the internet scenario that exists. That's one. I see last mile connectivity being a problem in both rural and urban areas. Urban areas where there is coverage, but there isn't really uptake in, go to low income areas or slum areas outside any of the metros and see what kind of information needs people have and how they are being met. And it's appalling. The scenario is appalling both in rural and urban. So I do think we need a plan for urban last mile connectivity as well. And those are going to be different aspects and different needs compared to the rural. I think infrastructure continues to haunt us, and it's not only a cost factor. If I cannot rely on technology because it is so unreliable and it is so frustrating for me as a rural person, I'm not going to invest in it. I'm not going to invest in it because I can't rely on it. So I do think that the issue of infrastructure and reliability and a provider that cares is very, very important. We need to support good business, fair business, local business is, all those are, I think, very, very important together with other factors as, enabling people to use technology, enabling good content. All those are very relevant in completing that last miles, loop that we are missing.
Okay, thanks. Mike, I'll come back to you, but first I want to bring Rajat into this. Yeah, Rajat. The question I wanted to, the input I would like from you, it's slightly shifting the discussion a little bit, and I just want to dwell a little bit on the economic impact by getting this last mile connectivity in place. I mean, we've seen projects from DEF and a whole lot of other organizations around the country which has done interesting work in the field, going to rural communities, setting up, what I would say more or less a very holistic sort of enterprise, a social enterprise, which provides connectivity. It also develops a local industry, helps them with e-commerce sites, gets the artisans out there, etc., etc. So perhaps some thoughts from you on, what you see as the impact. And of course, we've been on the juries together for DEF as well. So there's some great examples there that we can perhaps pick on as well. So please, thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Rajesh. So I think, the impacts at two levels. One is at the macro level, and the others that you're referring to at the micro level. But before I get into the impact, let me just share a couple of thoughts that I had with the previous speakers, and I agree with all of them. And one of the critical things I think that is being mentioned, if you deconstruct what they're saying, is that there's a role for the government and there's a role for the private sector, and there's no point for the government to try and second guess the private sector. So government should be providing the infrastructure up to the panchayat level and doing it efficiently. And if they provide it well enough, efficiently enough, then the private sector will step in and do what it does best, i.e. provide the business models, provide the entrepreneurs, and thereby create the impact. And I think where regulation or governance in the telecom sector has been weak, I wouldn't say failed, but has been weak, is because it's been knee-jerk, it's been reactive, and it hasn't looked at the sector holistically. Presently, we are facing this almost crisis, as Rajan will tell you. Now, how do you auction spectrum? Do you auction it, or do you give it out some other way? If you auction it, what is the price going to be? Are the price going to be passed on to the consumer? What is the certainty and predictability of the operators who are going to buy that spectrum? And the reason I'm saying this is because all of this increases the cost to the service provider, and thereby decreases or slows down the rollout of services to the eventual customer. So I think the government really has to think, the regulator has really got to think of what do you expect from the telecom sector. Are you going to treat it as a cash cow? Are you going to use it to try and overcome the infrastructure deficits that we face in the country? And can technology, can ICTs and can technology actually help you overcome those deficits? And I think the answer to that is yes, and that's the question you raised, is I think the huge infrastructure deficit, the huge social sector deficits that we have, I think telecom sector and ICT has a very big role to play. At the macro level, we know that the impacts across the world and within India are very large. The impacts of mobile are up to 1.2 to 1.5% of GDP. The impacts of internet are perhaps even larger, and I reckon that the impacts of broadband will be even larger. And if you kind of go down to the micro level and see some of the wonderful case studies across India and indeed across the subcontinent and across the world that the people have been able to develop, the payment system, the M-Pesa, the Chanderiya, using health applications, and this apps is becoming a big business as well now. And they have economic impacts, they have skill impacts, and they have, social impacts as well. So I think the government should play a very facilitating role for the sector, recognizes that impacts can be potentially huge in a country that suffers from very large infrastructure deficits and huge poverty and skill gaps. I won't give you the numbers, but just imagine that 700 million people live on less than $2 a day. I mean, that's the level of deprivation that one is talking about. And it's not going to, be cured overnight. But here is an instrument, here is a technology that can help you to bridge that much faster than any other way. And subsidies are not the way, I think, to go about, addressing the problem. I'm not talking about the subsidy that Rajan was talking about. I'm talking about subsidies or, MSPs and giving subsidies on diesel. That's not the way, because those will provide only temporary solutions. The Aadhaar, the direct transfer, which all uses technology. And that's the way to go. And I think the point about USO being used efficiently to address the infrastructure gaps is a very good idea. But the government has to think about, is it going to continue to treat the telecom sector as a cash cow? How is it that we are going to overcome the trust deficit between people like Rajan and the government? I think it's extremely important to bridge that trust gap because the telecom sector has a huge role to play in our economy. And we need to use that as an instrument. And the government needs to recognize that. And as blame games that have been played for the last 15, 20 years, I think they need to stop in the interest of using technology to reach out and have these big economic, social, and I think skill impacts as well.
So you raised the issue about spectrum auctions. I've always actually struggled with the whole concept of spectrum auctions, to be honest. So one question I would put to perhaps you three gentlemen at least, and perhaps some of the others as well. And I see a few others have joined us, so I'm sure they'll intervene as well. By auctioning spectrum to the highest bidder, are we imposing an additional tax on users? Because if simple business basics, right? I buy something, it costs me X, I mark it up by Y, and I sell it at Z. If the cost of acquiring the spectrum is, let's say, $1 billion, just for argument's sake, that cost has to go somewhere. So if suddenly now, without naming a telecom company, but telecom company ABC has paid $1 billion to acquire spectrum, they will want to recoup the cost, be it over time or in some way or form, correct? So would that not then increase the cost on the consumer, and therefore by giving $1 billion to the government, isn't in the end user paying for that cost in some way or form? So, Mike, with you, please.
I want to just add a comment to this one about the benefits that came out of publicly available 2.4 and 5.8 unlicensed bandwidth. The benefits that were transferred to people at large, India and elsewhere. And when the discussion goes to discussing spectrum, and specifically the 700 to 900 megahertz, which is hotly pursued by telcos and others, let's think of what it would do if this spectrum was given publicly rather than being auctioned yet once again, whatever the price point is.